Welcome everyone to this webinar. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're from. And my name is Tim Ward. I am the CEO of Clued In, and I am lucky enough to be joined by Martin Vickerslew from Sitecore. And today the topic of the webinar is around how can we get this mysterious, this infamous unified view of the customer. And the way that we are going to attack this challenge is by first looking at a platform that is able to gather information around our customers to be able to give them the best personalized experience across digital channels. And Martin is from Sitecore, who is one of the leaders in the digital experience management. And really the questions we want to answer in this session is, first of all, how can you achieve this unified view of a customer? What does it look like when you have it? What's the value of having it? And really challenge the idea of, is it the full unified view of the customer that we want? Or is it more that the data that we're after around these customers to be able to, for example, give better personalization, give better segmentation to our customers? So Martin is going to start us off in giving us a view of what can be achieved with Sitecore's tools with the unified view of the customer. And then from the Clued In side, we'll lead into how can you connect tools like Sitecore to more back office systems like the CRM system, the ERP system, where the rest of the story around the customer exists. So Martin, it's over to you, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you for the introduction. So as Tim mentioned, so I work for a company called Sitecore. And you may have heard of us and you may not know about what we do. So I'm just going to start off very briefly talking into the platform that Sitecore offers, but I will focus mainly on the data side of that whole thing. So basically, Sitecore was born as a web content management platform, and historically, almost 20 years ago, when the product was created, this was just a tool for you to create a website and update your content, and maybe have that content run in multiple languages on your website. That was the original idea, but the founders and the engineers in the company, they realized it's more interesting if we also know what is going on the website. So what they started doing was they would track anytime somebody was viewing a piece of content, regardless of the device they used, so mobile or computer or some other type of device, they would capture that engagement or interaction. And all of that data collected would then be fueling slowly more and more different types of marketing applications inside the same tool. So both feeding into showcasing analytics, but also being available to do personalization based on past experiences of a given visitor. And this journey actually started with collecting data back in 2009. So it's not something new Sitecore is doing, but we have, of course, improved not just the data that we collect and how we can collect data and what data we can collect inside the platform and outside the platform, but also how we offer the data to other systems. Because as Tim was also sort of pointing toward, is that no single tool may be the only solution you need when it comes to data and making something valuable out of it. And we also realize this in Sitecore because we collect a part of the understanding of what a customer or a visitor is doing, but it's more interesting if we start pairing that with other data. So to just give sort of a breakdown, Sitecore traditionally was, this platform to deliver content to virtually any channel. So these are just the typical channels that you have for digital marketing. And the backbone of that is really, the content management piece. This is the original core software that we created. There are some other aspects to this, but I'll just focus on mainly the content part today, and how with all the interactions that happen with the content served by our platform, that we collect, of course, analytics, but we also provide some insights based on the analytics so we can optimize or identify segments or maybe just market toward specific segments that we define ourselves. So all of the data that comes out of this being in operation will be stored in what we call an experience database in Sitecore. And the experience database is sort of an umbrella term for different ways of surfacing that data. We have something we call X-Profile that I'll highlight in a moment. And of course, we provide some high-level analytics, which to some extent can be compared a little bit to Google Analytics. And I'm saying that now because I often get the question anyway. So Sitecore is not the same as Google Analytics because we collect information server-side. But actually the two solutions go quite well hand in hand because we each provide some different angles toward understanding how traffic on your website may actually convert to more business. Then out here on the right hand side, we have right now it's still a sort of a small part of what we offer because it's quite new. It's something we call Sitecore Cortex, which is where we start to offer more machine learning based tools that will actually make sense of all the data that Sitecore has collected. And this Cortex part is something within the platform, but it can also operate with data from other sources. There's, again, to make the data Sitecore collect more interesting for other systems, or maybe learn from other systems and use it in the context of providing content out on the web channels. There's something called Sitecore X Connect, which is basically just a term for an API that allows you to take data from the Sitecore experience database and surface it into other systems, which could be, for example, a CRM system, or vice versa, maybe take data from the CRM system and put it into the experience database and use that kind of information out on the website. So just very high level, the architecture of the platform. And I'm just going to hide a little bit some of the points that are not going to be covered today. So for me, at least, one of the very interesting parts is the X profile, because when we talk about the single view of the customer, this is this out-of-the-box single view of the customer as much as the data Sitecore can provide. And to further enrich that understanding, not just what pages have a visitor seen or have they downloaded a certain file, we also add something we call the engagement value scale. That's just a simple concept where you can rate different interactions on your website based on what they have of internal value to you, like a strategic value. So somebody coming to a website asking for a quote, they seem pretty engaged with you and may become a customer soon if you just take the right action. Whereas somebody who's viewing maybe a video or a lot of your other content that you have paid a lot of money to produce, it's still important to know that they consume it, but it doesn't mean that they will become a customer right away. And in between, anything where you collect user information like an email address or a phone number obviously should have a fairly high strategic value as well. So this is a simple model, but when you overlay this and add this dimension to the raw traffic numbers, you get some interesting perspectives. And these are out-of-the-box analytics. So in this image, we're showing the blue bars are basically the amount of visitors that has come to the website, but the green line is showing the average amount of value based on the different scoring we have done per visit. So some days we have high traffic with a fairly high engagement value, and other days we still have pretty decent traffic, but the engagement value has dropped almost to nothing. There can be several reasons for that. It could be that somebody operated a Google campaign attracting people into a certain landing page, and then the message on the landing page is basically disconnected from what the people found on the search engine. And these can be, simple mistakes that people do in online marketing. They link to the wrong page in terms of campaigns or something like that, which is what you can identify quickly here. And obviously, it's fine to have a low amount of traffic, even if you have a high amount of value per visit generated. So we try to make our customers understand that quantity certainly can be better than, or quality, sorry, can be much better than quantity. A different perspective could be, because we collect a lot of data, we also have an option where you can define different personas or segments on your website, and obviously we can then give you analytics where you drill into those individual segments and see, well, if we have a certain persona on our website, are they converting well, or should we try and spend our marketing budget and effort on the other personas where the time to convert them into a customer may be shorter than some of the other segments. And also identify which campaigns should be the ones you focus more on. So there's an example here, the top campaign by visit. That's also standard information that you would get from Google Analytics, for example, based on the traffic numbers. But if we look a little bit closer, the campaign that actually generated more value per visit was not the same as the one that had the most visits. So some November newsletter was actually quite low on the list in terms of generating value on the website. So that's what we are doing out of the box to help our customers understand better what traffic means on their website, and giving them some insights to work with that. So starting off talking about the single view of the customer, I'm finally getting to that bit, because we are collecting the customer experience data every step of the way. And ultimately, when somebody comes to a website for the first time, they will be regarded as an anonymous visitor. And they could have come from any channel. It could be paid advertising. Maybe they're using a mobile. Maybe they're using a laptop. There are some things that we know right away based on the browser identification and so on. But they will remain anonymous until they actually start telling us who they are. So over time, Sycor will keep track of the individual visitors and just gather all the information from the first visit and the third visit and the 10th visit, however many times they come back. But it gets really interesting at the point in time where they actually give us some information like an email address, or maybe they log in with their Facebook ID if we have that service on our site. And we'll certainly have a lot of information about the user. And certainly also if they use the social media tool to log in, we can also capture the data that, for example, Facebook will expose. Of course, that set of data is getting more and more limited, but it will still give us some information that we could put into our picture and our unique view of the customer. So all this data for all the interactions will go into the Sycor Experience database. Zooming in a little bit, this is our view of the visitor or the customer, our single view, with a timeline for all the engagement and interactions they have done, which could be website visits, or if they have opened an app or opened an email sent by our solution. And then with the option to drill into the individual visits they have done, or see a list of the campaigns they're currently engaged in. It could be that they're in marketing automation plans that we are operating from our platform. All of that can be seen on this individual level. And if I zoom in just a little bit more, these are the out-of-the-box data that Sycor can present based on what we collect through the channels that we are controlling. But we do offer, of course, that you can integrate this to other systems. And the most relevant one would probably be a CRM, so that you can bind the profile from the data Sycor has gathered together with data in the CRM, where you may already have similar customer information, but you don't have the history of what your visitors are doing online. And this can be interesting in a sales situation where you know you're going to call up a certain customer prospect, but before you make the call, maybe you go in here and see what you know about them and what they've done on the website recently. Or you take the integration to the next step and actually take data from Sycor and put into your CRM, so that your CRM would feature a list of the most recent downloads they have done on your website, or how much time they've been spending in the last month on your website, or whatever metric would be important for you in terms of figuring out if that customer prospect is closing in on being a customer, or maybe have lost interest in you altogether. But there could be other data sources as well. In some cases, in commerce, for example, it would be an ERP system that would hold most of the information about previous purchases by your customer. So these are just some examples. But yeah, wait a minute. That's just Sycor's perspective and what we can bring to the table. It may not be the single view of the customer that you need, because you are also today relying on data from other systems like your CRM, and you don't yet have an integration with your website with the level of data that Sycor can provide, or you're using other systems than the ones we may have connectors for already. And where do you start? And even having 10 different systems will make that problem even bigger. So I guess the truth is that nobody really have or know everything about your customer. What Sycor can bring to the table is we know what I call the dirty secrets from our visitors, because what we have also seen when Sycor has been reaching out to our customer prospects is that sometimes they will go silent. They will not pick up the phone. They will not answer the emails right away. But then when we look into our analytics, we can see that they're active on our different websites, which is typically a sign that procurement has taken over. They're doing due diligence. They don't want to be interrupted by Sycor. They want to figure out information on their own, like how many partners do we have in their region, what kind of customer cases are available from their vertical, who's on the board of Sycor, and all of this kind of information. And we can see that while we are also having information about them in the typical sales tools like a CRM. So that's also why Sycor is offering access to the data that we collect with an API that allows you to basically handpick the information that's relevant to you and put it into your sales tools where it makes sense for you. And that will help you, of course, see the bigger picture. So how we actually play a role in this is that virtually or not virtually, every single interaction that happens on the Sycor, for example, a website, is captured by the platform. And like we saw that short screenshot before, it gets very detailed on an individual level. And some companies, maybe more the B2B companies, will have time to go in and digest and look through information about a specific prospect that's interesting for them. If you're a huge B2C operation, you may not have time to go in and look at all of these individual data sets. You will just use it for learning maybe a little bit about select customers. But then we also provide the data available in real time, because the whole architecture that we have built to capture this much data also scales very well, and the reporting is happening in real time, so you can see updated data at any point. Then there's the point of maybe just taking relevant data and surfacing that in a CRM, or taking data from a CRM or ERP and putting it into Sycor to give you a benefit in terms of being really personal, or giving what we also call individualized experiences based on past knowledge about a customer. Finally, Sycor, we also know that, yeah, we are collecting data, we are collecting it in our format, which is good for our scaling and our architecture, but a lot of businesses today, they also use different business intelligence tools in other parts of their enterprise. And Sycor, therefore, we make our data available in format that can be consumed by, for example, Power BI and these kind of business intelligence tools. So you can start taking the data from the channels under Sycor's control and utilize it in other parts of your enterprise in the business intelligence setup, and maybe learn something from that. To make things a little easier to work with, because you can imagine a website that has even just 10,000 visitors per day will generate a lot of data from all the interactions that happen on the site. So to make a little bit more sense of all the data we collect, we also some years ago introduced a tool we call the Path Analyzer, and it's actually using some simple machine learning to identify and visualize the different journeys that has happened throughout the content that Sycor is controlling, and highlight where this has given very positive effects in terms of more conversions and more generated value. Back to the slide I had with the pyramid or the triangle with the engagement value scale, and also identify the journeys where it's not so positive, the journeys where people drop off. And that could be quite interesting in understanding, for example, if there's a certain flow that you want your visitors to go through. That typically translates more into commerce, where you have the whole shopping experience and you want to see if they drop off before they do the final entering of their credit card and complete the payment. But it could also be used in other scenarios where you just want the visitors to get, from being fairly interested in your content to actually, learning more and more about your product and being more interested to actually ask you to have a meeting or something like that. And figuring out, where they drop off in between is certainly something of value. So you can improve that internally. Because we collect so much data, and we already did provide tools to make personalization on the website based on the data that we had collected. We also wanted to make it easier for our customers, and there was also a demand to offer a machine learning based approach where Sitecore can look into the data and find some insights and use them to help adopt and drive more personalization on the website. Because we as humans can come up with some scenarios that we think will be relevant to convert more visitors into customers, but all the data that we collect can certainly also come up with some useful suggestions that we can then just say, yeah, let's try that scenario that you recommend based on the data that we have in the system. And basically, this is it. I mean, data is key, and that's certainly also where Clued-in has something to say later when I'll give the word back. But when you have a lot of data, it really needs some tools underneath to help you find the needle in the haystack. So Sitecore can provide you the data. We also give you some of the tools to help make use of the data, and integrating it with a CRM or other business tools is certainly also important. But since we sit both on the content side and the analytics, and it's really one and the same platform, we can provide what we call the predictive outcomes in terms of looking at the data and coming up with good suggestions. So that was the small part of the slide earlier with the architecture that with the tool we call Sitecore Cortex, which is really just an umbrella term for all the things we can do inside Sitecore with machine learning. So I'm not going to explain the model here, because my point is not to talk to you about machine learning. It's more to talk to you about what do we get from that? What do we get from the data that Sitecore will crunch for us? How can we use it, and will it bring value to us? So there's all these components and the machine learning workers and the models that you can work with in Sitecore, either with the machine learning service we offer, or you can replace it with another machine learning service that you want to use. And then we have the APIs and the reporting and the option to expose our data into, for example, Power BI, like I mentioned. So just to give a real world example here, so in our product, out of the box, we have this option. Here we've seen that one of the suggested personalization rules that the system came up with after a lot of traffic had been through a particular scenario is that in this case, the system, based on the data, identified that if the visitor came from either the country Denmark or Netherlands, and they had been exposed to one of the 10% campaign or 10% discount campaigns, and that had been triggered, then that was a certain portion of the visitors, but the ones that fell into this segment actually had a better or higher predicted effect in terms of the rest of the visitors. So that's pretty good. I mean, if we can improve the conversion rate for a very, very well-defined segment, why not do it? Why not try and get these extra conversions? Because the system found out this by looking at all the data. I certainly myself would not have come up with this just by looking at a few reports and tried to stitch together the same kind of picture. So this is where working with data gets really interesting. When we have enough data or different data sources to add into this mix, maybe the CRM data, we can build some very interesting scenarios and hopefully convert as much more visitors as predicted in the calculations. We can also work more with predictive outcomes. So instead of just saying, well, if the visitor has done this, or if the visitor has seen that, or they downloaded this file, we can work more with probability and say, well, if they match a certain goal by a certain rate, so in this case it could be, we have set it to a percentage, so 80%, then we need them to see this advertisement to push them further into becoming a customer, or make sure they get more relevant information that they seem interested in, which will help them hopefully become a customer. So data really is key. Now, this is all good from a product presentation, and this is sort of the best case scenario, I would say, because just getting up and running with a platform and then starting to collect data and make sense of the data is not going to happen in a week, right? You need to collect data over time, and you need to understand the data and have somebody who can analyze it properly. If you, of course, not only trust a machine learning service to do that for you. So I wanted to close out and give you some insights to how we at Sitecore, who should be the experts of using our platform and working with all these great tools on our website and our different digital channels. So I'm just going to give you some insight to how we are actually drinking our own champagne. Obviously, the different Sitecore sites that you can enter are using our own tool, and we are collecting a lot of data from all of that engagement that happens on our website. And what we do whenever somebody is signing up for a newsletter, or they want to download a case study or sign up for training or a webinar, all that user data they submit on the site, we store that into our CRM. And we are currently using Salesforce for that. But we don't only store their name and email, we also store and move this collected engagement value, so the aggregated score that a certain visitor has accumulated over a session or multiple sessions before they gave us data to contact them. We store that as well. So our internal team that is ready to call up people who have asked for a case study, asked to be on a webinar, if they have a high score, obviously they are calling those leads first, and then going down the list. So we use this as sort of a sales scoring metric to identify who is really interested in our product that we should focus on and call up first, and then work our way down the list of the people who have engaged with our different channels. So it quickly, for a Sitecore, becomes a CRM-driven sales process, but it's relying on the heavy amount of data that we have collected on our digital channels, so we can understand who to call first. So that's actually quite simple. If you think about it, that we're just using data collected on the site that gets stored in a CRM, but with the added dimension of how engaged is that visitor. So that's definitely something we're doing today. And on the other side, we also have a great amount of data collected in Sitecore that we can utilize to personalize the experience for the visitors when they come back, or move them between different segments to make sure that they are receiving the right type of newsletter and not just a generic newsletter. And then, of course, we still have the option, because Sitecore is a heavy B2B enterprise company, that we can go in and look at the different prospects we are communicating with. We can go in and see, what are they actually doing on our website? Have they downloaded the white paper I recommend that they should? Because that's a good way for me to follow up with them. So with that ending note, hopefully there are a lot of great questions, but I'll say thank you for your time and give the word back to Tim. So Tim, over to you.
Thank you, Martin. And I think you and I would both agree that the amount of data is growing and growing with businesses today. And really, the idea is, how do we make sense of this? And to add to that, it's really, you were touching on this idea of the universal view of the customer. And what I'm hoping to take you through is, how do you complete this from systems like Sitecore to the rest of the stack where the other pieces of the customer exist. So with that in mind, I'll start by saying platforms like Sitecore are really focused on the digital experience management. So making sure that we're capturing the data and analytics around the digital channels. And this not only spans, of course, from the website, but mobile and print and social media, etc. Really what the focus of platforms like Clued In is on the data foundation. So it's putting in the foundations in place to making sure that once we have this data, that it's in the right place, is integrated properly, it's cleaned, it's governed, it's enriched, and it's made very accessible to the other parts of the business. Martin mentioned tools like Power BI and Tableau, etc., including things like the X profile. This is where business users are consuming the value of the data. So it's our goal at Clued In to really provide the proper data foundation to build things like the unified view. So really, Clued In builds and provides this data foundation so that companies like Sitecore's customers can focus on the use cases. And the main focus of today's webinar is really around, how does Clued In facilitate knowing more about your customer? And one of the great side effects of this is, once you know a little bit more about your customers, this is also plays into the EU regulations around, transparency with your customers, that you can actually, show your customers what data that you have on them, and fulfill their rights around, rights for portability, rights for access, rights for deletion, etc. And this support comes from platforms like Clued In. So where we talk to our customers about building the unified view, this is typically where their time is spent. There is a large effort around organizational effort in gathering who are the owners of all of the systems where the customer data exists. And of course, working in the enterprise, and with Clued In being enterprise focused as well as Sitecore, that it's not the enterprise without some politics and operational efforts. So security, access control, permissions, governance, etc. And then after we have the data, there is such a huge amount of time spent on the data preparation piece. So this is actually one of the things we see as one of the roadblocks in customers getting the true unified view of the customer. And it's because data is not created equally. And different systems will store different pieces of data in different formats with different validation rules. And this makes it hard to prepare a unified, ubiquitous version or golden record of your customer. And Gartner, they estimate that customers and companies spend 60 to 80% of their time on data preparation when they're wanting to get value out of their data. So unfortunately, when we're wanting to focus on the business use case, such as personalizing the Sitecore platform towards a customer, then really most of the time is actually spent on the non-value adding work. So with platforms like Clued In, this is where we are able to move our customers. Much more time spent on the business use case, a lot less time done on the data preparation and organizational effort, because we have the data foundation in place that makes your data much more readily available to the forefront of the use cases. Now, like me, many of you have probably seen this within your systems. This is one of the main things that stops us getting a unified view of the customer. So we take our CRM system, we look up a contact, and we realize we've got 5 people with different email addresses, but they're actually the same person. And this doesn't matter if you're using CRMs targeted towards small and medium businesses. Maybe you're using something enterprise like Salesforce this problem still exists. And this is the status quo for most enterprises today. And you can imagine that if this is a problem even within this tool itself, you can start to imagine the problem as we introduce more tools to our stack. So really at Clued In, our focus is on providing platforms like Sitecore with this unanimous, ubiquitous, unified view of the customer. And this only comes by stepping through a couple of processes that I'll highlight right now. Really, the first complexity starts with integration. Integration is typically an underestimated problem. It's typically a lot harder than you would expect. And these projects with integration usually end up going a lot longer because of this. And because Clued In has to date out of box over 200 integrations to platforms like Sitecore XDB, Dynamics, Salesforce, databases, SaaS platforms, what this means is that the actual analyzing of this data from systems like Sitecore, this is something that happens very quickly. So as we use our out-of-the-box integrations to bring in data, one of the first things that Clued In is going to do to prepare the data to be unified into a single view of the customer is we need to set some benchmarks of quality. So as of recently, Clued In has upgraded to measure 12 different metrics of data. And this includes metrics like completeness, quality, relevance, accuracy, validity, connectivity, and staleness. Now, these all sound a little bit synonymous, but in the data world, they're measuring very different things in overall data quality. It's really important that we set the benchmark before we start to unify customers. So after we've done this, it's also worth establishing that the technology landscape is growing. And like a few years ago, the focus was majorly on relational databases and how they can solve our data problems. This has shifted. There are 15 different types of database families that we have choice to build with today. And all of these different database families were built to solve different problems. So that's why one of the first things that Clued In is going to do is it's going to take these records from a platform like the XDB, and it's going to store this data in different formats in different database families. And this is helping for two main reasons. Firstly, it's going to prepare our data for the cleaning phase, but also it offers us a lot of flexibility when we're also wanting to get data out of this foundation. Now, before, once again, we can start to look into the unification or merging or deduplication of customer records, Clued In has to go through some normalization processes, some data cleaning and data scrubbing. And there are many automatic techniques that can be applied. Normalization of dates, phone numbers, addresses. These are all things that can be automated with a high statistical confidence. But you can imagine that we don't want to even start to look at merging records until our data is in a little bit better quality to make decisions on this. So after Clued In has gone through its automatic data scrubbing process, the next process is around classification. So you can imagine that we have a person in our CRM system. The variance of categorization of this person will of course differ. They might be a lead, they might be a decision maker, they might be a contact, they might be a customer. These are all different categorizations of essentially a core entity type like a person. So Clued In has built-in categorization to help us understand our data a little bit more before we look into building this unified view. So after the categorization has come into play, one of the first things we'll do is start to look at records across the different systems that have a unique ID. So something like an email address is a unique ID. However, it's only unique if you combine it with the source of where the data came from, the account that it came from, and of course, the email address itself. So we can be quite confident or highly confident that if people have the same email addresses, but they're from different systems, we can pretty much safely merge these records or connect them in some way. Now, there are exceptions to these rules, and of course, platforms like Clued cater for those. But what I wanted to highlight here is that this is how most companies are solving their problem today, in that it's expected that we have these unique IDs or universal IDs that are threaded through our systems. And if this was the case, then forming the unified view of the customer would not really be a problem. However, as you can imagine, with structured data in different systems, and of course with unstructured data, this becomes the problem that we need to solve in a different way. Optionally, we will also, through the Clued platform, allow you to enrich the data. So if we have Barak, he's in our CycleXDB, we have his first name, last name, and email address. We can use over 30 plus enrichment services that Clued integrates into, including Hoover's, Data.com, Clearbit, and even some free sources like Glassdoor and Company House and Open Corporates. And so we use this external data to help us once again prepare the data as much as possible before we even think about merging it to form this unified view of the customer. So it's only at this point that we start to look at that process. And one of the common techniques that we see companies take here is what is called string distance functions. So we look at two records side by side. We might have one of these records from the CycleXDB. We might have one of these records from the Salesforce CRM. And then we start to play with the data a little bit. We start to see, can we normalize the dates so they are in the same format and check if they're the same. We can have dictionaries that tell us that the US and USA should refer to the same country. And we could also see things like maybe the city of Washington is an abbreviation for Washington, D.C. Now, you could probably imagine that this is quite a naive approach to solving this problem. So one of the ways that Clued takes this approach is, as Martin also alluded to, a machine learning approach. And essentially what we're doing is we've realized at Clued that everybody's data looks different, right? We enter data into different systems in different ways, even if we're using the same product. And what this results in is that it really needs your data to tell us how these two records should merge. So what we take is what's called a clustering approach. And what this does is that we highlight different properties on these two records, such as the date of birth and first name and last name, and we start to add different weights to, if these are the same or similar, how likely are these two records to be the same individual? Now, this yields really good results, much better than the traditional side-by-side document or entity approaches. But it's worth mentioning that this by itself will still not yield a good unified view of the customer. A good example that you'll probably all be used to is, I have the same person, but I have them registered under 5 different email addresses. And one is a public address, one's a private address, one's a work address, and so forth. So we need to use other techniques to be able to help us with forming this unified view. It is worth mentioning that as Clued is unifying these records and blending these records, it's so important to establish that we are also keeping the full lineage and history of these mergers over time. Just because we have one email on Barak and another email from another system, that doesn't mean that both aren't correct. So this full lineage also allows us to go back in time and actually look at what was merged 3, 4, 5 years ago. So this tracking is there in place for our auditing as well. So let's look at another angle. Merging data and unifying a record is not simply about metadata matching. One of the databases that we use to store the data that sits across your foundation is a graph database. So let's step outside the world of just looking at two records side by side, and let's start to look around those records. So let's look at the documents those individuals are working on. Let's look at the emails that they're sending. Let's look at the calendar events that they're invited to. And let's continue with the same process of thinking, well, is there any overlap between those records? As you can see in this example, the White House and White House, you could probably argue that these are probably the same organization. But if we do this more and more, we start to build the statistical confidence that maybe Barack Obama and Hussein Obama are actually the same person. We refer to this as context. And context is so important when we're wanting to build the unified view of a record, and in this particular case, of a customer. But it doesn't end there. Imagine we still don't know that this is the same person. We can then leverage the graph once again to look at the full network of how these two records are connected. And the highlight here is that people won't always be directly connected to the same types of things. It might be indirect. So using the graph technology, we're allowed to ask, what do Barack and Obama and Hussein Obama have in common? How are they connected? And we can use the paths that overlap between these records to also help us check, is there a lot of overlap happening in these records? Once again, we can use this to boost our confidence in merging these records into a unified view of Barack. Now, it's worth mentioning that there's a lot of work involved in cleaning and preparing data before the perfect unified view of your customer will exist. And there are many things that fall through the crack. There are many automatic cleaning techniques that won't capture all the dirty data. And for those reasons, we have a catch-all interface we call Clued-in Clean. Clued-in Clean is targeted towards a data engineer to be able to help normalize the data a little bit more that a machine can't necessarily help out with. Now, we also have an interface called Clued-in Train. Now, many of our customers will know that this is really the secret sauce behind what allows Clued-in to get such high precision with forming the unified view of a record. And the important kind of hurdle to get over with this type of platform is using a technique in machine learning called reinforcement learning. And I like to describe it like bringing up a child. I have a 2-year-old boy called Finn, and if I was wanting him to teach him something, I realized that I'm not just going to show him once and he'll understand. I need to reiterate many times. So for example, if we were in the kitchen and I showed Finn a knife and I said, no, don't touch this. Now, the chances are if I showed that to him again and said no, maybe when the knife is out, he'll come over and take a look and think, I can't really remember if I should touch this or not. And then what if I showed a teddy bear to Finn and I said, this is okay to touch. You can always touch this. This is fine. Now, after I instill those messages in him 10, 15, 20 times, if I was then to bring in maybe a lighter, so to light the flame in the kitchen, this technique would basically is about teaching the system that, hey, Finn, I know you've never seen this before, but you should be able to make up your mind now on if this is a good or bad thing that you should touch. And this technique can be applied to data. So in this particular case, a business user is being asked, hey, is Push the name of an organization? And it's just up for that business user to say yes or no. It's not up for that business user to correct the data and say, no, that's actually a product that we're using, or no, that's not an organization or a product, it's something else. That's not the goal behind this platform. The goal is to basically teach the Clued-In system to help clean your data and prepare it for a better view of, for example, the customer over time. Now, it wouldn't be a good story if we weren't having proper data governance in place. So you can probably imagine that it's so important if we've got personal data around our customers, they should really be treated like absolute gold from a privacy and a security perspective. So for this, we have our data governance piece. It's making sure that we track where the data is stored, from what systems it came in, where is it being used, is it high risk, is it personally identified, is it encrypted properly? This gives us the confidence to be able to use our data in tools like Tableau, Sitecore Xprofile, Power BI, machine learning platforms, and more. Not to mention that because we have this unified view of the customer, we can also start to use the Clued-In platform to help us in the data privacy area of things like the right for portability, the right for access. So let's use our data now. This is what it looks like. So now if I was to look up a record within our accounts at Clued-In, you can see up the top that the first record is me. And you can see all the little icons below that record that are essentially identifying that, hey, we found a little bit of information on this record from across these different systems. And as I drill into this individual record, what you are getting here is that unified view. This is the unified view of everything connected to me, whether it's activity that I'm working on now, like an event, whether it's issues that I'm working on in a tracking system, or just the metadata itself. Now, really the goal behind Clued-In is to prepare this data so that you can interact with it in other systems. And that's where our API enters. So at Clued-In, we give a simple API via a query language called GraphQL for you to be able to not only surface this data, but to really push it into other platforms like Power BI, Tableau, Azure ML, RapidMiner, etc. Pretty much just think of any tool where to start getting value out of them, you need data. You need good quality, governed, tracked, accurate, complete data. This is the foundation that Clued-In provides. And with integrations into platforms like Sitecore, like Salesforce, and over 200 more integrations, this idea of being able to get the unified view of the customer is no longer really a pipe dream. It's much more easily accessible and achievable. So with that in mind, I'd like to close with one summary thought. What we find as a trend when we're talking to our customers that have achieved the unified view of their customer, typically, as Martin alluded to, this is something we would surface inside their CRM system. And the real question I'd like to pose to those on the webinar is, if we had all of this data in one place, visible, and we could look back through all the history of a customer and how they've interacted with us from all different systems, there's the potential for this to be quite overwhelming, especially for customers you've had for a very long time. You could imagine all the email correspondence, all the calendar events, all the sales contracts and discussions, all the analytics, all of the goals, all the visits they've had on all the different channels, all the emails or newsletters they've been sent through the campaign system. So this feels like a lot. So what we're actually seeing as a trend with our customers is it's not so much important of having the single view of your customer, but the data of your customer in single type of structure. This is what allows us to push this data over to value-adding systems like BI, like advanced analytics, like the CRM system, to make better automated decisions around, hey, what should we do for this customer next? So with that in mind and that thought that I will leave with you, I want to thank Martin for joining me on this webinar. I want to thank you all for attending, and I hope to see you at the next webinar. Have a good day.